Okay, as we enter this section, we're going to be talking about license law and commission rules. Now, this is a portion of the test that's going to be tested very, very strictly. So as you listen to this, please listen to the inflections of my voice so that you'll know specifically what to go back and study on and be very, very specific in looking for your answer. So starting it off, basic license requirement. Any person or entity who provides brokerage services for others for compensation must have a license. Now, I want you to notice on this particular slide, it seems very simple to read, but there's things that you have to pay close attention to. Any person or entity, my license has my name on it when I became licensed in North Carolina. However, also when I created an entity such as an LLC or a corporation that ended up being compensated in a transaction, that had to have a license as well. And then the other key here is that provides brokerage services. In just a moment, we're going to define for you what brokerage services actually mean. And then notice as it ends on this slide, it says for others for compensation. I often ask a question of my class, the first day of class, where I'll say something to the effect of, how many of you could go out and sell your neighbor's house today and it not be illegal? And all of them say, well, no, that's why we're here. We couldn't sell the house. Actually, any of you could go sell your neighbor's house today if you wanted to without a license. However, you can't be compensated for it. So the reason you need a license is to sell for others for compensation. A lot of information on that one particular slide there. You're almost certain to get test questions in regards to that. Let's dig deeper. This slide deals with the fact that in North Carolina, there is only one type of license. It is a broker license. Having said that, when you come out of this class and you get your license, you pass all your testing and things like that, you will actually be on provisional status. So when we talk about there's only one license, there's a broker license, there are several statuses. So we'll talk a little bit later about what it means to be a provisional broker. You guys will be very aware of that because you're in the process of trying to become provisional brokers right now. And you'll see that basically that is taking this 75-hour course, passing a state exam, passing a national exam. You'll take them at the same time, and that you'll have to be supervised by a broker in charge. That's all. This will come up later, but that's just it in a nutshell. Also, another license category is a broker. Oftentimes for test purposes, you'll see this described as a non-provisional broker. In other words, a broker, what I refer to as a full broker, but the commission often in the test often refers to it as a non-provisional broker, someone who's no longer on provisional status. Broker in charge, here's another status. Now, some of you will never be brokers in charge. Not everybody chooses to be a broker in charge. But if you start your own company, or if you want to lead an office, if you want to supervise provisional brokers, you will be a broker in charge. And we'll go over in detail what it takes to reach that status as well. Limited non-resident commercial broker. We won't spend a lot of time on this. However, I encourage you to look at the name of this license. Limited non-resident commercial broker. So you're limited to doing commercial sales, and you apparently live outside of the state of North Carolina. That's what makes you a non-resident. In an effort to be friendly to commercial agents who often travel large geographic areas, North Carolina created this status to allow for people to do commercial transactions without having to go through the whole 75-hour course. And then the licensing of business entities. As I said, when I'm just Chris, that's fine. I have a license that says that. However, if I want to create an entity, an LLC that says the Holly Springs Realtor LLC or something to that effect, now I've created an entity. And for that entity to be compensated, it has to have a license as well. There is only one license in North Carolina. That's a broker license. The rest of these are just statuses. Now, this is very, very important here. Activities requiring a license. On the first slide, I mentioned to you that we're going to find what brokerage services are. This is that slide where we're defining what brokerage services are. So if you like mnemonics, here's one. LL Beans, okay? LL Beans, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that catalog. I guess they're still around, but it actually talks about what you need a license to do. If you're going to list property for sale, if you're going to lease the property of others for lease, if you're going to buy, in other words, work with buyers on that, if you're going to exchange, The significance of this point is it doesn't have to be a traditional sale. If it's going to involve the conveyance of one property to another, even something like a 1031 exchange, well, there still has to be a license if you're going to be compensated. If you're going to auction, now a lot of people don't realize that auctioneers have to have a real estate license. Well, let's be more specific. If what they auction is real property, they have to have a real estate license. So in other words, not just a license to do auctioneering, but also a license to sell real estate if that's what it is that they're auctioning. Even as something as simple as negotiating a sale involves having a real estate license. And then, of course, if you're going to sell, if you're going to work for sellers, then you're going to need a license as well. There's one that didn't make the list just because we tried to shorten it to meet our mnemonic. But also, if you're going to advertise to do any of these things, the simple act of advertising to do any of these things creates brokerage. But again, look at this last bullet point before I leave this slide. What we're doing is we're doing any of these functions right here for others for compensation. You can do any of things that are on this list, but the reason that you need a license is because you're doing it for someone else for compensation. I promise you that there is going to be a test question built in there, and you'll see why in just a moment when we get to our exemptions. Let's keep going, and it feels a little bit awkward sometimes the way that the way this goes. However, I'm just following the syllabus as it is written by the Real Estate Commission. So now we jump over to permitted activities for, look at this key here, unlicensed assistants. So what is it that an assistant of a real estate agent can do without a license? And basically you see under number 1 there, unlicensed assistants can perform administrative tasks, and they don't need a license. Now, on number 2, I'm actually going to cheat because you have another document called the License Law and Rule Comments, which I have encouraged you to read. As a matter of fact, if you look at my materials, you'll see that I have asked you to read this 3 times in preparation for the state portion of the exam. Almost half the state exam, the state portion of the exam, comes from that document. It's a 22-page document. Within that document, there's going to be a list that the Real Estate Commission has put together of activities that an unlicensed person can do. I would have you pay close attention to that. Now, listen, since you're already here, let me give you a big cheat on these. Unlicensed persons, if they're an unlicensed salaried employee of a property management company, you will find out that that person can, in fact, show properties for lease. But here's what I promise you. An unlicensed person can never show properties for sale. Okay, watch out for that one on the exam. The other one is that an unlicensed person can never negotiate. So let's think, for example, if you're working for a property manager and you're being paid a salary, so you don't have a license, and you're on site and someone comes in one day and says, good gosh, $1,200 rent, that sounds too high. Can you make an adjustment? Unlicensed assistant can't do it. The property manager might be able to do it. Or they say, Chris, look, your deposit's way, way too high on this. Can you come down on a deposit? I'm okay with the rent, but the deposit's too high. An unlicensed assistant can't do it, but the property manager might be able to do it. I'm encouraging you to look at that list in the license law and rule comments section, as well as the extended 22 pages. Read that 3 times, please, before you take the state exam. And then finally, you see the 3rd bullet point there mentions exactly what I said just a moment ago. Never show property for sale, only property for lease. Now, closely associated with this, the exam is also going to quiz you on exempt activities. And here's what we mean by exempt activities. Who doesn't need a license to sell real estate? Okay, so I want you to look at these really closely. Some of these are going to make complete sense. Some of them are not. So I'll have to explain what they mean. So look at the first one, a business entity selling or leasing entity-owned property. Well, let me give you the most simple version of this. Think about new home sales. When you think about new home sales, they often have someone who's sitting on site. That person may or may not be licensed. It really doesn't matter, because when you're looking at a large company like a Pulte or a Syntex or someone like that, they have salaried employees. When you think about it, a business entity can only work through the actions of its employees, okay? So what we're saying here is if it's a business entity selling their own houses, they can't sell anything else. They can't go out and take listings, but they can sell their own houses. They do not need a real estate license to do that. They're a glorified for sale by owner, is all it amounts to. Be prepared for that on the exam. Send me a question if you need further guidance on that. When we talk about an attorney in fact, you may have heard of a power of attorney in the past. Someone who is given the power of attorney to act on behalf of someone else does not need a license to deal in that particular transaction. However, having said that, that's the only transaction that this this obligation is waived. So, in other words, if I have the power of attorney for my parent because they're unable to manage their own affairs. So I am given the power of attorney to do that. The power of attorney could actually say I'm entitled to be compensated for that, even if I don't have a license. That doesn't mean I have a right to go out and list other properties. I can only be compensated for the properties on which I was named a power of attorney. Okay. An attorney at law can actually be paid for real estate transaction as well. However, let's use some common sense on this one. The attorney at law can only be paid for a real estate transaction that comes up in the natural flow of their business. If you'll remember from an earlier lecture, we often talk about attorneys acting as trustees in a in a foreclosure sale, for example. When they're acting as that trustee, they can be compensated. Why? Because it came up in the normal function of their business, the normal course of their business. Now, an attorney can't just go out and get a bunch of signs and start listing properties, even though they are well acquainted with real estate transactions. They cannot go out and do that unless they have a real estate license. They can't do it for compensation. Okay. So their exemption only arises if it comes up in the normal course of their law practice. Someone acting under a court order, a guardian, an executor, a trustee, these people can be compensated for their time if it is in fact in the document which gives them the authority to do this. So if the court order allows a guardian or an executor to be compensated for their time, they can be compensated, but only for that transaction. Trustee, I mentioned in a foreclosure auction, oftentimes it's an attorney performing a task. The salaried employee of a property manager, now let me remind you that salaried employee of a property manager cannot be paid on a case by case basis. So oftentimes when you see someone sitting at a apartment complex, they're getting a salary. They're not getting compensated every time they rent a unit. To be compensated on a particular transaction, they would actually have to have a real estate license. So keep your eye on this one on the exam. The salaried employee of a property management company, what they can and cannot do. And also be very, very careful on the exam when you start dealing with property manager who can and cannot be paid. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. An individual selling their own property, well, this makes complete sense, right? If I am selling my own property without an agent, it's fine for me to be compensated because it's my property. But let me tell you the more important point here. The more important point is that individuals involved in a transaction can be compensated. And here's why. Do you remember that I described brokerage to you earlier as being for others for compensation? The for sale by owner is doing it for himself. Let me give you two more great examples that you're likely to see on the exam. What if I'm working with a buyer one day in a transaction, and as a buyer's agent, I'm going to make, let's say, 3%. And the buyer's agent says, good gosh, Chris, you're making $12,000 because I'm buying a $400,000 house. And I say, yeah, as your buyer's agent, that's what I'm going to be compensated. And the buyer's agent said, excuse me, and the buyer says, well, why don't you give me $2,000 of that money? Well, the fact of the matter is, I'm not encouraging you to do this, but he's not asking you to do anything illegal. He is a principal. The buyer is a principal in the transaction. He's not getting paid for others. So I can legally give him that $2,000. Again, I'm not encouraging you to do this from a business standpoint, but it's absolutely legal. One last thing I'd like to say on that is that be careful if this comes up on the exam or in the field for that matter. And the reason is oftentimes lenders are concerned about concessions such as these. And so you would want to make sure it's approved by the lender and want to make sure it appears on the settlement statement. That's a little different issue, but that could come up in a different chapter as well. Now, let me tell you why I'm spending some time on this. I told you I'd come back to property management in just a second as well. Well, when you look at a property management company and the way they work and the way they have the ability to generate business, Let me give you an example like this. So I'm a property management company and rents are down. We have some vacant units and I want to try to stimulate some leads so that I can rent some properties. Well, let's talk about what I can do and what I cannot do. What I cannot do as a property manager is go to my current tenants and say, hey guys, if you will send me someone to rent from me who ultimately rents from me, I will give you an extra month's rent. Okay, I want you to listen closely again. As the property manager, I can't go to the other tenants and say, if you send me a new tenant, I will give you an extra month's rent. Why? Because I just gave them some valuable consideration, a month's rent, in exchange for the referral. And they don't have a license, so they're not entitled to receive it. In other words, on the test, it's not just dollars, it's valuable consideration. If I'm going to give them a free month's rent, they would actually have to have a real estate license. However, notice what I just told you about the for sale by owner. It also applies to the for rent by owner. So could the property manager actually make an offer to a new tenant coming in and say something like this? Hey, tenant, listen, if you will sign a 12-month lease, I will give you a 13th month free. And the answer in this case is yeah, absolutely, they can do that because the new tenant is the principal in the transaction. He can get whatever you want to give him. Okay. So notice that distinction. I can almost promise you that that's going to be part of a test question. And then finally, it wraps up by saying that they're employees of housing authorities who actually receive compensation for selling or renting properties. If they are an employee of a housing authority and they sell or rent the property owned by the housing authority, they can be compensated as well. Doesn't really come up that often. In these first few slides, you have seen some very, very valuable information. Who needs a license or what, an entity for that matter? What is brokerage services? Unlicensed assistant activities and exempt activities. Clearly, there will be multiple questions on the exam on these.